Okay, here we go. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our most recent SEAMH Symposium. We have Dr. Peter Brown with us today, who will be discussing masculinities, mortality, and mental health, understanding the male longevity disadvantage. Dr. Brown is a professor of global health at the Rollins School of Public Health and professor emeritus of anthropology at Emory University. He has published over 60 articles and chapters and given over 140 professional presentations. His current research interests include the history of malaria and malaria control in relation to current anti-malaria policy, male gender life course and health, and culture and obesity. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Elena, and hello to all of you. Please do raise your hand, and if Elena, if you can monitor the chat room with questions too, and interrupt me. This is what I want to do is first start out with a story that's in the New York Times today, and it's a good story about a dairy farmer in Wisconsin. And then I really have two topics. Both of them are related to questions of mental health. And the first one is what I call the male longevity disadvantage. That is, why do men not live as long as women? And this is an interesting question, I think, from an anthropological point of view, because there's biological, social, psychological reasons for this, but also evolutionary ones. So I have been working on a project that kind of talks about the evolutionary theory in terms of the sexes. Part of the question is why in humans is why there's postmenopausal period for women that lasts a long time, different than other animals. Then biological questions about violence and so forth, and then the variation in kinds of masculinities in different cultures, but also looking at the United States, all sorts of different kinds of masculinities. And sometimes there's been discussions recently of toxic masculinity, but we'll just refer to it as hegemonic heterosexual masculinity. And I think the role of mental health is interesting here because the healthcare seeking behavior of men seems to be different than that of women. And it's so policy wise, that's a good question. And then I want to talk about suicide, obviously a consequence of depression most of the time. But in the United States, we have this very strange, at least to me, situation with the US gun culture. And it's associated with men and certain kinds of men, and we'll talk about that. This story in the New York Times today is about this widow, and it is about her reactions after her husband committed suicide, and she started a whole program in terms of rural mental health, and particularly men helping men, but families helping families in rural areas. And one of the things she says in this article is her husband had struggled with depression for a long time, but she said, these men will ask all the other guys for help if they combining their fields or doing anything, but they will never ask for help in terms of so emotional problems, mental problems. Here's the beginning of that article. So I'll let you read this, but it starts with the story of flooding in the fields and how this is going. This is a farming weather dependent. So either too much rain or not enough rain can really cause problems. And although for his whole life, he was a dairy farmer, he had recently sold his cows. So he was just farming regular grain crops. So he had he did his chores, left a note in his work pants, said that depression had robbed him of hope and the pride he had in running a third generation dairy farm. And then his wife says that most families suffer losses, suffer suicides in silence, with a stigma. And in fact, in terms of mental health policy, the battling of stigma seems to be a very important challenge. So the story itself is about this program called the Farmer Angel Network. And I think it's very, very interesting and an example of indigenous reaction to mental health crisis. But it really reminded me right away of a similar epidemic of suicides among farmers in India around 2017-18, and this was related to a drought, and then in this particular year, 60,000 Indians just in the state of Punjab. How when the drought happens around here, the rate goes up a lot. I'm sorry that I will use a lot of kind of figures and so forth. I tend to be a visual learner, but this was a really a terrible period in India, and lots of these farmers, it was because of the barely making a living and then having failed crops would make them a failure and threaten the lives of their families. But that whole idea of feeling as a failure is or that this is your fault, I think is interesting. But really coming home here, these are my parents a long time ago. And I started thinking about this, I guess over 20 years ago, when my father was dying and I was taking care of him. He had COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, had trouble breathing. My mother on the left here is still alive. So she has now lived more than 20 years, or it will be 20 years after my father died. So then if you look at that, think about that in terms of life chances, their experience was quite different. My father told me, when I asked him at one point, well, why do you think men don't live as long as women? He just said, that's just the way it is. which to me wasn't very satisfying. And he said, well, there was a period in my life when I smoked cigars. And I never remembered that, never saw it. But I realized that he commuted in Los Angeles on the freeways for at least 2 hours every day in a unair conditioned Volkswagen Bug. And in the period of time where there was just such terrible smog. And that idea that this was an environmental condition which he had no control over, and he took it for granted that that's normal. In other words, blaming himself for the lung disease rather than this incredible exposure to toxins with smog. So my mother didn't work outside of the home. She didn't have that kind of exposure. She also didn't have the same kinds of stresses. 97 and is healthy in her body. She has some dementia, but I thought that was something that interested me. And this seems to be a universal in humans, or more or less. There's a couple exceptions here, but you could see that here, Soviet Union, 15-year difference. In the United States, it's 4 years. I looked it up for Southeast Asia. I mean, 5 years. Now, all of this kind of demographic data has problems with the data itself. But this is an interesting question because we don't see this phenomena in other animals. So this is the same type of thing. If there was gender parity, you would that would be this green line. So you see everything is above this green line. That the males are I'm sorry, the females have a longer life expectancy. Of course, the males in all of these curve between wealth and health. Now it says my internet's unstable, so tell me if you can't hear me.
Oh, yeah, Peter, I was going to say you have been cutting in and out just a little bit, but
okay. Well,
yeah.
I'm sorry about that. So anyway, you could see here that the difference, the relationship between health and wealth on a national basis is very, very interesting, or historically, but the gap seems to get larger as societies get richer. One of Emory alumni, Michelle Parsons, did work on this question in Russia, and her book Dying Unneeded is the cultural context of the Russian mortality crisis. Some people in public health at this time, right at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the life expectancy of men really declined for a long time, and it took a decade and a half for it to return to what it had been. You could see here that women's life expectancy was always higher, but the whole question was, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and worse outcome you see this dive is deeper for the men than the women.
Peter, sorry to interrupt.
I think that this is interesting. The title of the book is so good because these men who were of the generation, kind of the greatest generation, they were had survived the Great Patriotic War, World War II, had really believed in the dreams of communism and knew that their socialist society wasn't perfect, but there was a utopia at the end in the future sometimes. And but the unemployment went really terrible and people died. They didn't die. And then the question here is interesting, is that they didn't, this isn't a suicide situation. These are increases in deaths in cardiovascular disease, heart disease, and so forth, as well as alcoholism. Of course, alcoholism is a mental health problem. I looked this up for Asia, and you could see here that the difference here is all these differences. They look these the women live longer than men, and you can, I believe, and they are the longest living people in the world today, or at least the women are. So looking at the United States, we could look at this question about sex differences in death rates. Of course, this has to be age adjusted if you're thinking about epidemiology. But I think that this is quite amazing if you, in all of these, except for stroke, and which is even ratio, and Alzheimer's disease, the men have a higher rate than women. But look at the suicide number. It's 3 times as high. Or Parkinson's, it's 2 times as high. Accidents, 2 times as high, twice as much. And so I think that this is interesting. In other words, men's health seems to be worse than women's health. And in public health, I think it's interesting because most attention why do men die earlier when they have more power, social power, money, and status than women. Part of it is that they have money to use for things that are bad for their health, like tobacco, alcohol, buying sex, those types of things. So I want to talk about this this biopsychosocial model of the of stress and health, and this is something I'm sure everybody's been talking about. But the idea is that we're living in an environment, but stress on any one of these systems your social system or your having a disease can affect your psychological well-being, but also your social situation as we as we go on. But I should say that this idea of the natural biological superiority of women is not a new idea. Actually, Montague's book 7 years ago is about this. And my friend and colleague Mel Connor recently, or feels like recently, published a great book from a evolutionary standpoint. He's a biological anthropologist, called Women After All. And I would recommend that book with up-to-date of the of male and female differences in here Margaret Mead's talking about this in terms of temperament, but also we know, and in the seminar that I teach, I'm not going to talk about it today, but the difference between male and female brains. We should point out here when I talk about gender that you have to separate the biological, that gender and sex are quite complicated, and their sexual orientation, sexual identity, biological or genetic set, they are all separate, but for the majority of humans, they overlap. But the differences between cultures in the way in which one, particularly for men, who men have to be made all the time and have to defend themselves. So there's some biological factors. One of the things here is we know that chronic testosterone exposure reduces life expectancy. We know this from animals that neutered animals live longer, grow faster than neutered males do, and the same thing happens with eunuchs, the studies of them. So estrogen has some, both obviously both males and females have both estrogen and testosterone. There's that different levels, but estrogen seems to have some very healthy aspects. Testosterone, I'm not so sure what's the benefit of it, except for in terms of male-male competition in evolution. Women have more sensitive immune systems, and this is a reason why there's more autoimmune diseases in women than men. But the Y chromosome is associated with all sorts of different genetic diseases. Males have a greater inflammatory reaction. And males have the most important part is a thinner corpus callosum, and this is the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres, that balances out. So this is the emotional part of the brain. And then males have a larger body size, and animals with larger bodies do not live as long as smaller bodies. There are psychological factors, so in this tripartite model. And I think a lot of this, I want to talk about this idea of hegemonic masculinities. And this is this kind of idea of quote, real men. And the notion here is that men are supposed to be independent. They don't need social support, but manhood or masculinity has to be earned. You have to be made into a man. This is why we have these rites of passage for males just about everywhere in the world. But your honor, your manhood, your masculinity can be taken. It's in competition with other men. So this whole idea of honor is very widespread, and defending honor sometimes can lead to violence. So it's also that this idea that men big, strong, and in fact, if we think about this in terms of sick role, it's hard to be manly and sick at the same time. My wife says that when I'm sick, I act like a baby, and that's, in other words, not like an adult man. Maybe I do, but you can't be manly and sick at the same time. So men seek help either for biological problems or for psychological problems. And then if we look at this, is that real men might have many sexual partners. And this idea in evolutionary theory about mate guarding really has to do with jealousy and results in domestic violence. So the only emotion men are supposed to really express is anger. So the consequences, I think, are interesting because just about most men, we don't have percentage on this, but most men can't be this way. So in that sense, most men eventually lose in competition with other men. If this kind of competition might be economic, it might be sexual, it might have to do with competition in terms of body composition and so forth, or athletic ability. But in the end, you realize that there's people who are better than you, and they will tell you that you don't live up to these ideas. The notion in the United States now is that we might even just say these are kind of Trumpers, the angry white men who resent social change, so the diversity changing demographics, and feel like they are taking away stuff from us. It is what Kimmel calls aggrieved entitlement. So men think that they are, and with feminist movement, this reaction is that they are losing something. It's a type of delusion, but men is that psychologists are talking about the male experience of depression might be different. It says I'm unstable again. Might be different as it's experienced, but more with less social support, that and with more stigma or admitting depression. And then we'll see in terms of suicide, women do suicidal attempts or life-threatening behavior much more often than men, but men are so-called successful at this. And then nurses tell us that the old saying in nursing is women get sicker, but men die quicker. And it does seem to me
Soon we lost Brown.
Yeah, we do seem to be having some connectivity issues. Sorry about that. It seems to be sort of, I mean, for the most part, it's just, you know, a slow, I mean, a slight delay, but let's see if he comes back or not. Otherwise, he might have to reconnect. Oh, I think you're right.
I think when he comes back, if you know, we could tell Peter to turn off his camera, or you could just turn it off
Oh.
yourself.
Yeah, turn off his
Given
camera. That's a good
that you're
idea.
the host.
Yes. Hey, everyone. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but I hope you're finding the presentation interesting nonetheless. Oh,
Yes,
Peter, there
I
you
want
are.
him to come back.
Peter, if you could turn off the camera, that might help, like just with connectivity a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. Also, Peter, you are currently muted. We need you to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Can you
yeah,
hear me and not see me? Okay.
we can't
And
see
it
you.
does- Okay.
We need your
But
slides
please,
again.
please share. Yeah, please share your slide.
Where was I here? Okay. So this is a very good book, and I recommend it. And it's interesting. This is a book from the 90s, but they keep using Donald Trump as an example. So it's before he was in politics at all. So that entitlement and attitude, I think, is resulted about anger, is about emotion. But one of my former students, Dan Smith, has written a book about masculinity, money, and intimacy in Nigeria. And I like the title of this book too. To be a man is not a one-day job. One of the things he did during field work, he's a tennis player, and he joined a tennis club, and which was all men, and talking about the dynamics and the way in which they talked as a group about money seems to be so important. And this idea of employment is or having meaningful work being successful in the sense that you being economically successful, and particularly also in terms of the that kind of idea of the working man and supporting a family and all of that. We do know from the earliest Framingham studies on heart disease that one of the biggest risk factors for a second heart attack is unemployment. So if you go back to a family or you go back to work, those have conditioning, they buffer you. So now I want to talk about, these are social or social factors, and there's 12 of them here. And again, I'm talking about probabilities, but men dominate in dangerous occupations. And of course, you could think historically that being in the army is traditionally all men then with feminism, things have become more equal, but in general dangerous occupations. And the provider role creates financial stress. Men are more likely to be incarcerated, men are more likely to be in military combat. You can think about the gender differences in mortality, let's say in Ukraine or something. Older men seem to be unconcerned about diet and being overweight. And that idea of maybe in the United States, there is overemphasis or over concern by women in terms of diet or the stigma of overweight. Men drink more alcohol. This is interesting because alcohol has some benefits, but becoming alcoholic will shorten your life. They're more likely to smoke cigarettes. They're more likely to be the victims of violence. They are more successful for suicides. They have more sexual partners. There's really good evidence that women are much less dangerous automobile drivers, and men are more likely to be homeless. So those are all social factors. And again, the gender differences might be small, but I think that they are there. I just want to say that if this is my brother who died 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, from AIDS, and he was one of the smartest men I ever knew. But at one point he says, and he got AIDS after we knew it was HIV and sexually transmitted. But he said, you can't control lust. So I think that this is so interesting is that when we think about life expectancies that way. And at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in the United States, of course, it was much higher in men who have sex with men. But in places like Africa, it was simply being a married woman was the strongest risk factor. That has since changed. Men now outnumber women again. This is a good website in terms of the history of the HIV epidemic. I'm just kind of realizing that some people who aren't as old as I am recently retired, and look at my book collection, and so much of it is about AIDS. It's worthwhile to think about how that pandemic unfolded. Okay, I want to talk now more about suicide and then of gun violence. As I said before, all of these, whenever I look at this quantitative data, it's the best available. It has all sorts of problems, but I think that the overall trends are correct. In the United States, you can see here that, and just in the just this year, 2023, we had all these mass shootings, and this was 3 weeks ago is the first time I remember a woman being a shooter in this way. But there's more suicides than murders in terms of gun violence. And you could also see here is that the health challenge of gun violence really has a lot to do with morbidity. But if we look at gun-related deaths in high-income countries, the United States is just so different. And I'm sure you people living in Southeast Asia and so forth know that this is a particularly and weird and terrible American phenomena. So that whole idea of how we have a gun culture, and of course the gun culture is associated with the angry white males and so forth. We own a lot of firearms in the United States, and American civilians own about half of the world's non-military guns. So only 5% of the world population has guns, but there's more than one firearm per person in the United States. And it is just growing all the time, having a lot to do with fear. But we could see here in terms of gun ownership, the pattern is male, rural, non-college educated will get to we'll get to this. Anyway, but this sounds exactly like in this recent book, Deaths of Despair by the economists Chase and Deaton, an excellent book. And it talks about this idea of what has happened in the last 30 years is the death rate for non-college educated whites has increased a whole lot. And we see if the difference between blacks with a college degree and no college degree, look at the difference in here in with whites. So the deaths of despair are related to the opioid epidemic, the increasing alcoholism, suicide, and so forth. So this is things I've already said. And these are things that we've already talked about. As I admitted, I'm putting two talks together that they have overlap. But I do think that this idea of role expectations and stress, it is not necessarily, women have a harder life, but seem to experience failure in a bad way. Here's a gender difference in health. These are our cardiovascular disease, heart disease. But you could see that this is, I don't have the date on here. This is somewhat old. This is about 40 years ago. And women have been catching up. In other words, the rate of heart disease in women has increased with economic change. So let's talk about suicide in terms of the social epidemiological distribution. Oops, this is a bad slide. That's an old topic in sociology, obviously. The father of sociology, Merle.
Peter, I just
Yeah?
wanted, sorry, would you mind wrapping up in about 10 minutes, just so we have a little time for questions if people have them?
Okay, I will do that. Okay, well, let's just go through these.
Okay, thank you.
About firearms, if you look at the idea of suicide from Freud's point of view, he says that there's three simultaneous desires, and that they are related to depression and a kind of a solution to depression. But he talked about this idea of narcissistic components. I don't know about personality disorders, but I would think that narcissism is more a characteristic of men than women. It is, suicide's a huge problem in terms of morbidity and mortality. And as I said before, it is the suicidal behavior might be different between men and women. It certainly is in terms of the choices of that. So suicide rates are higher and they have been increasing. These are the places in the world with the highest suicide rates. I'm sorry, I can't see my whole slide. More statistics. Okay. One of the things that I think is interesting in gun violence and suicide, it seems to be the Western states in the United States. These are the part of the country that has more of a gun culture, cowboy kind of culture. It's interesting that it is not as predominant in the ex-Confederate states. Males have always had higher rates. It's interesting here. Sorry, you can't see this slide, but it's African American women who have the lowest rates. And until recently, where now we have a bump in suicides in middle age, it is older men who commit suicide more often. Here's the same type of thing. We can see age and suicide rates. Too many rates. The suicide rate in American Indians and Alaska Natives is very high in the younger populations. And I think that this is an interesting, challenging public health question about why that is the case. So Alaska and Montana have the highest gun uses. We're going to need to look at this. Suicides and depression are related to life problems and not necessarily with or without a mental health diagnosis. But I think the interesting thing here is the most common is relationship problems. But this idea of a crisis or obviously addiction is a type of way of adapting. Okay, and so this is more about being a man, the 4 kinds of masculinities, this idea of muscles. I like this old saying, this no sissy stuff, big wheels, sturdy oak, give him hell. And on each one of these, they are related to health behavior. Okay. There's 2 periods of male life cycle where gun violence is most prominent: the adolescent adult transition and the retirement transition. I think that this is that's a hypothesis I have. There is within sociology a whole kind of general strain theory, but males and females have a different pattern here in terms of strain resulted in anger, where their theory is that the strain results in fear and desperation rather than the negative emotions of anger, rage, and jealousy. The idea of stress is interesting. You could use engineering for this too. So I'm going to go through all of this. Okay. American gun culture is very strange, but it's got to do with a particular history. But today it has to do with politics, very much so. There's no single American gun culture, but we could see the different types. And they are used for a wide variety of things, but the purchasing seems to be related to fear sometimes in terms of protection. But there's these other functions that I think that are relevant to anthropologists to understand this. Okay, so gun politics in the United States tends to be polarized between advocates of gun rights, often conservative, and those who support stricter gun control or safety, and they're often liberals. But these angry white men talk about liberals as not real men. And so we can look at that type of thing. So masculinity, suicide, there's some positive aspects of guns, but there's more negative aspects of guns. We know this epidemiologically. That's it. I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry I went long. I didn't keep track of the time.
Oh, yeah, don't worry about that. It's, you know, we started a little late anyway, since we wanted to give, you know, people time to join us,
Yeah.
and more people did
We
join
had a
us, so
lot.
that's great.
A lot of people joined us. Yeah, great. Oh, and I could turn on my
Yes,
camera.
now if people wanted, if you feel like you want to turn on your camera now, feel free to do so. Hopefully we won't have more connectivity issues.
That's my wife's name. She is.
Yes, I know it always comes up as Betsy. So now is your opportunity to ask any questions that you might have for Dr. Brown. And it looks like we have a few already in the chat. I just think it's really interesting in general. And I know, this is also something that Dr. Trang studies, really looking at the issue of men's health, because when we think about gender, usually immediately people think of women's health. So, actually putting the microscope on men is really interesting. So let's see. Oh, okay. So one of the first questions we have in the chat is, what do you think accounts for the lower suicide rate among African-American women?
I think that this is a real interesting question, but older African-American women have more social support. They might have more strain, but suicide and tend to be more religious. So sometimes these suicide statistics are bad because the stigma, what families want to cover it up. But when I talk to African-American students, this whole idea of the positionality or respect given to older African-American women within a family is very important. And so I think that they have more social support. Women have more friends. So we could talk about this epidemic of loneliness in the United States, considered a public health problem, but I think there's a gendered aspect of that. Somebody asked about the brain stuff. Okay.
Yes, Mai asked, the male has a bigger amygdala. What does it mean?
So there's different parts of the brain, but we could say that the amygdala is the so-called reptile brain. It's where our emotions and immediate reactions are. And so therefore, men have less control over, men are less rational and are more prone to violence or extreme reaction. And so that's the most primitive part of the brain. These are small differences, very small differences, but they are significant. The corpus callosum is a structure in the brain that connects the two hemispheres. But this results in more evened or balanced neurological behavior. And so women's brains are better in that regard of making connections between the functions of the right hemisphere and left hemisphere. And you know, I don't do neuroscience, so I'm kind of pushing this.
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I didn't know if you were moving on to the next question from Tom Palm, or if that was also
Yeah,
related to
okay.
the brain.
This is the larger amygdala. Larger body size. This is just in animals in general, that within the same species, larger animals don't live as long. Dogs are an example, or horses, and it does have to do with just plain physiology of size of the heart and so forth. I think so the larger body size is a disadvantage in terms of longevity, but of course the larger body size, the difference, the sexual dimorphism between males and females is the result of evolution. And the main part of Mel Connor's book is that males were selected for upper body strength and that kind of these male kind of behaviors and so forth in competition with other men. In evolutionary theory, we're always talking about females choosing mates, males. So males compete and they compete to be higher on a dominance hierarchy, but in other animals and so forth, the the females choose. And I think that's actually more the case in humans in modern societies than people think. Men deceive themselves to think that they do the choosing, although they might use violence in that regard. Does that help, Tom? Okay.
Yeah, then she had, I'm not certain, Tom, if you want to ask the second part of the question, are there any implications for policy or public health initiatives that should be considered in light of the findings about the male longevity disadvantage?
So there's a reason, and I didn't talk about intersectionality here. And so the intersectionality of gender, ethnicity, and social class. So our biggest health problems in the United States are with African-American men and Native American men. There are different kinds of programs, but they haven't been very successful. And some of this are programs against, quote, toxic masculinity. Yeah, I do think there's a whole thing of men's movements and so forth. I do find after I retired, I joined a men's book club. I thought that was very interesting, an interesting group of people. But men don't interact with other men except when there's alcohol involved. And that's really interesting, is that it seems to be that they need the alcohol in order to, it's a social lubricant. And what men's conversations are about are quite limited and not about relationships and emotions and so forth.
I have a quick question about that, though. That just came to mind. Did you mean in the United States? Is that specific to the United States or other cultures?
Yeah, all this stuff I've been thinking about here is the United States.
Oh,
So,
okay. Just because I know sometimes when I've lived in other, not that there aren't large like drinking cultures among men in other countries too, but I know sometimes that I've heard men from other countries say that they were like shocked and surprised by the extent to which like men couldn't be together in the US unless they were, you know, completely inebriated. So
yeah, so part of this does have to do with homophobia. And
mhm.
somebody asked later, who defines being a man? And that's a very interesting question, but we usually define it in the negative. It's not a boy, it's not a woman, and it is not a homosexual. And so, but what it is this blurry ideal that essentially I don't think anybody can live up to. But we have the myth that some people do, or they present themselves in that way.
So the next question is from Panya, and he said, thank you for your points. From a public health perspective, what kind of strategies or programs can be used to help prevent male suicide? And second, what type of strategies or programs can be used to promote male health, you know, to increase longevity? He said he noticed that there were not many programs in Cambodia to promote male health specifically or to prevent suicide.
Yep, I'm not a policy person, and I guess I think more about the problems rather than the solutions. The regular public health effort, suicide, it can be combated by having people talk about it to reduce the stigma. So I think one of the things, and that seems to be happening in the United States, that public figures, men, will come out as having depression or so forth. So our recently elected senator, and these are very good things. I'm not sure if programs necessarily themselves affect the upstream causes, but this idea of having someone to talk to. We know in global health, for example, in community-based mental health programs in Africa, I'm very impressed by this work of which were called grandmother listening benches, and outside of, and so that really this is a matter of sharing problems and getting, you know, behavioral cognitive therapy is about identifying distorted thought patterns and so forth. And the way you do that is talking with somebody else. So it can be low tech, but also in this global health movement, the use of psychopharmaceuticals, I think, are very important and as a medical tool. So rather than thinking of these as just problems of living or being a failure. Anyway, programs, I'm sorry, I can't think of a lot of them right offhand. There's some literature that these telephone helplines do help. You do see more warnings about this, about suicide. To me, part of this problem is really the men seem to make more impulsive choices that with non-reversible means to kill themselves. So
Yeah, I was going to mention something about that. Actually, as you know, we just had this global mental health workshop at Georgetown, and one of the participants who came from Cambodia, and she works at the same organization that some of the people on the call here work from as well, said that they have started especially increasing their telephone helplines since COVID in Cambodia, and that they do get a lot of calls from people who are suicidal. And that especially those are often men who are by themselves and call them about 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. That's interesting. And it is that idea of talking to somebody else but it is sharing problems is not, male socialization is, not only boys don't cry, but they aren't supposed to complain and or share very well. And so I do think that this is all in the United States. This is changing, part of culture change, and it's all a very good thing. But I do think that we need more public health outreach that is men talking with men. So if you look, for example, I teach in the School of Public Health, and 90% of our students are women. So the interest in health and or particularly mental health is not considered manly.
And just moving on to, we have the next question is from Savatana. And these are, I guess, more sort of philosophical questions. He asks you, in your opinion, what defines masculinity? And also, how do you decide if something is morally right and morally wrong? Please elaborate.
Okay, I'm looking.
Yeah, those are big questions. So
Yeah. Yeah, can you specify a little bit more? I don't know how to pronounce
let me
that.
see if he's
Savana?
here.
Yeah.
Savatanak, are you still here? I'm not sure if I do see his square.
There.
Yeah,
Okay.
hi, Doc. I am still here. So for that question, because we talk a lot about, what defines a man. So I believe my question is very similar to that. Like, how do you define
How do I define?
a man? Yeah. Masculinity.
Yeah,
How do you
well,
define masculinity? How do you define femininity?
as I said before, it is, it's a cultural construct, and it changes between different societies. And that there's a wide variety of how to be a man, but that gets defined of what's not manly. So, the ideals that I said there are just part of the cultural things. I don't know if I have a single opinion. I do think that being manly and being a gentleman, for example, might be different. But the morally right and morally wrong, I'm not sure what you're asking about.
So for the second question, what I mean is, how do you define morality? Is it like a social construct? How do you know, let's say when people say that, okay, this is the right thing to do, how do you know if it's actually right?
Yeah, I
Who
think
is there to judge?
so anthropologists are going to be relativists completely here. and say this is a social construct. It is interesting in that we take suicide, for example, and when Durkheim was talking about it, we could think that honor can be so important to a man, so that committing suicide it seems, for example, in traditional upper class Japanese society, it was that ritual suicide was considered honorable, the right thing to do. Whereas in the Christian West, it has been against the law, right? It is a sin, and it can be, and there's societies still where it is against the law, and if somebody commits suicide, the family gets in trouble, has to pay fines or so forth. Is suicide right or wrong? Physician-assisted suicide. Those are good, difficult questions. But in general, societies seem to have a consensus about these things, and you could see it therefore in terms of laws, customs, and so forth. I don't know if there's any. I don't know how you decide. I'm sorry, I'm being so vague, but they're big questions.
Yes, they are. And you're right that the idea of whether these things and done in particular ways are right or wrong is going to depend a lot on cultural context. And another thing that came up in these conversations I just had over the last couple of days with Sopiap from TPO Cambodia, who unfortunately can't join us, but several of you know her, is that she said that one of the trends that she had noticed recently in Cambodia as well was suicides in which men would kill the children along with themselves, but not their wives, which I thought was really interesting, because that's like not at all how we think about the idea of like the family annihilator in the United States. You know, that usually there's this like paradigm of a family annihilator in the United States, who's usually a man who kills, you know, the entire family and kills himself. So that was the first time I had ever heard of that, and I wondered like why that cultural model might exist. I'll have to talk to more people about it. So
yeah, I mean, it might have to do with how the kinship system works.
I think it might. Yeah.
Is that in a patrilineal society, then the children belong to the man and the man's group.
Right.
So
That's what she said. She said that the children belong to the man, but the wife doesn't belong to the man. She belongs to her parents.
right. Mhm.
Yeah. So that might be part of it. Let's see. We have more people. We had a question here from Bona. He wanted to know, he was interested in the point you made about farmers and why they might have a higher suicide rate. And you know, if you had any thoughts about that, any reasons why that might be the case.
Well, farming is a very it's dependent on factors that you can't control, right? And there's this idea that and that economically it's difficult. I think that these ones are economically in the United States. It's very difficult because it's become industrialized and people go bankrupt all the time. But there's honor in being a farmer in the United States, but there's not money in it. And you can fail. And I think that story of that Leon in the beginning was, he obviously had a predisposition to depression. He did seek help once and got shock therapy, and that worked for a while. But he never wanted to talk about these problems with anybody. But the the Indian case, a lot of these men had loans with money lenders at exorbitant rates are a problem or a situation in India that puts people in great strain if they can't repay. And for example, in terms of organ donation, not donation, and people sell their organs, it's often because of these loans and needing to pay them off or trying to pay them off.
Yeah.
Mm.
Let's see, and then we have the next question is from Sakuntia. And she also thanked you for the presentation. And I guess this would also be more sort of a policy or health education question. She wants to know how we can help men to change their mindset of being masculine, the mindset that men must be strong or that they can do everything without needing help from others, and that they should not talk about something. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm trying to scroll down to change their mindset. Cultures are always changing, right? But cultures are basically conservative. They don't want to change. So change is difficult. And in my mind, a lot of it happens in terms of generations. So I see in the United States, there being changes in my lifetime, but a lot of this is just the result is the result of feminism. But feminism means that men who thought they deserve the privileges, they're being taken away from them. They get angry. But how do you change it? Oh, the way you raise the boys. That's, it's socialization. How you teach boys about using words instead of fighting, or and so forth, or talking out rather than just reacting. If you watch children, you'll see there's big differences, and that idea of the difference between a boy and a man has much to do with, Freud would say, relationships with mothers. But you don't have a mother who you could complain to the same way. I'm not sure, but we can help them by destigmatizing getting mental health care. We can. I think that's a primary one, and to make things available. I don't think it always needs to be tailored for particular genders, but it needs to be available and appropriate and affordable. Those things.
I had a couple quick questions too.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, looking at gender differences and then also modern society, if women's longevity tends to decline as they enter the workforce and take on what you would think of as more traditionally male roles, and also how divorce affects the life expectancy of both men and women.
I don't know. I think that those are excellent questions. I think economic, divorce doesn't seem to have the same type of stress consequences for men than women. The divorce is harder on women, but by far in the United States, women are uh, initiate divorces. How it affects longevity, I don't know. But it would seem to me that being in a bad marriage would be more stressful than being independent. But I think that's a good question. But we do have that all that evidence about education. I think it is important. It's not the education; it's what it means in terms of job opportunities and financial independence. So anyway, excellent questions. I don't know.
That's okay. You can't answer all of them. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up for tonight. It's getting quite late, and thank you, Peter, for taking the time to talk to everyone so late in the evening.
Well, wonderful. Feel free to email me at any time. I'm happy to chat or whatever. I know that in these contexts, people are sometimes shy, but and I do think that the you know it is that being a male is a disability, and I don't think people ever think about that. You have disabilities, but on the other hand, you're supposed to be in control, and so that idea going all the way back to 50 years ago in terms of females being biologically and cognitively superior is simply true. And in societies where you don't need upper body strength in order to do things, that men are not going to be able to compete as well. And that just seems to be the sad fact. It would takes a lot of humility for a man to say that. But anyway, I think it's true. Kathy has a smile that way. But yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for coming and for all of your questions. I dropped Professor Brown's email in the chat for those of you who would like to be in touch with him. Kathy, did you have anything you wanted to add, or you study men too, so?
No, I mean, I think it was really fascinating, Peter, listening to you speak. And yeah, I think it's really exciting to see like the increased momentum around men's health. I think particularly like in my own area of like early childhood development, so much of it has focused on mothers and intervening at the level of mothers, but you come to realize actually the success, since they're embedded in a family, that really you need to address men and men's mental health as well. And so I've been really heartened to see efforts at that, which has been, so difficult, right? To engage men in interventions. They don't want to talk about mental health. They don't necessarily want to engage with that. But the ones that have successfully recruited, I think, have found, that you are able to change beliefs and parenting practices and reduce gender-based violence and all of that stuff. So I think, emerging field, but exciting.
Yeah, no, I think it's going in a positive direction.
Oh, and we've also been,
sure...
oh, sorry, continue.
Oh, no, I'm sure that like many of the folks here will feel inspired by your talk to take up men's health.
Good, you should do that. So when you think of gender, you just think that men have gender too. Right,
yeah, also a thing that men have. Oh yeah, and then we were asked about where the recording will be posted. We post them on YouTube, right? Is that, yeah, it will be posted on YouTube.
Yeah, and if you like our page, which you should, then we'll also provide a link to it on the page.
All right. Well, thank you all very much, and good night or good
Thank you.
day, depending on what
Thank you.
part of the world you're
Have
in.
a good day. All right, good evening. Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much, Peter,
Thank you.
to your
See you guys
longevity.
later. Okay, bye-bye.
And Akunjaran for those joining from Cambodia.
Thank you.
Akunjaran.